The hall was buzzing with quiet chatter and the occasional cough. Rows of seats were slowly filling with people who had come to see the talent show. Some were families, some were friends supporting their children, and a few older people had come because they loved music. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and the faint hint of old curtains. Lights were bright, almost blinding, but they didn't bother her as much as the whispers and laughter that floated from the back of the room. She stood at the entrance for a moment, glancing at the crowd. Their eyes, she noticed, weren't just curious, they were judging. The way she dressed, the way she carried herself, it all seemed wrong to them. She had worn her simplest dress and her old shoes, the ones she had practiced in for years. Nothing fancy, nothing that could make people look at her and think, yes, she belongs here. And yet, she knew this was her moment. She had waited for years for a chance like this. Walking slowly toward the stage, she felt her heart pounding. Her hands were clammy and her stomach twisted into knots. Each step seemed louder than the last, echoing in the large hall. A few people glanced at her and exchanged smirks. One older man shook his head, almost as if he were saying, "This won't end well." She forced herself to ignore them, focusing instead on the grand piano that sat in the center of the stage. Its polished surface reflected the lights and the faces in the crowd, a silent challenge daring her to fail or succeed. As she reached the piano, she took a deep breath and ran her fingers over the keys gently. They were cold at first, but familiar. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and thought about all the hours she had spent practicing alone, nights when the house was silent, the only sound being the soft clicks of the piano keys. Days when her hands ached and her fingers wouldn't cooperate, and yet she kept going. No one had seen those moments. No one had believed that she could get this far. Opening her eyes, she saw the audience more clearly. Some people were talking quietly to each other. Others were glancing at their phones, and a few had even leaned back in their chairs, ready to laugh if things went wrong. It hurt a little to see them so ready to doubt her. But she reminded herself that she didn't play for them. She played for the music, for the feeling it gave her, and for the small, quiet voice inside her that had never stopped believing. The stage seemed to grow larger as she sat down on the piano bench. Her feet didn't reach the floor properly, and she adjusted nervously, aware of every little movement. She could feel eyes on her, sharp and critical, and for a moment she wondered if she was really brave enough to do this. Then she remembered something her mother had once told her. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting even when you are afraid. With that thought, she placed her hands on the keys and let herself feel the piano. It wasn't just a wooden instrument. It was a friend, a companion through lonely nights, a place where she could pour everything she felt. Joy, sadness, frustration, hope. She thought about the melody she had been preparing for months, each note carefully chosen to tell a story. To speak the words she couldn't always say out loud. As she waited for the music to begin, a small laugh came from the back of the hall. Someone whispered something and a few others giggled. Her stomach sank for a moment, but she closed her eyes and breathed slowly, trying to push the negativity away. They didn't know her story. They didn't know the mornings she had woken up before sunrise to practice, or the nights she had cried because her hands wouldn't do what she wanted them to. They didn't know the dream she had nurtured quietly, the dream of sharing her music with people who might actually listen. The light seemed a little softer now, or maybe it was just her mind focusing. She positioned her fingers carefully, feeling the familiar texture of the keys. This was it. One small, simple note and the music would start. She pressed the key gently and a sound rang out clear and steady. It wasn't loud, but it was perfect. Another note, then another, until the first few bars of her melody filled the hall. The audience shifted in their seats. A few eyebrows rose. Some heads tilted slightly, curious now. The laughter and whispers had not completely disappeared, but they had grown quieter. She felt a tiny spark of confidence. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to notice that this was more than just a girl sitting at a piano. Her hands moved more freely now. The music began to flow. Soft at first, almost like a secret being shared. She felt the rhythm in her chest, the beat of her heart merging with the beat of the piano. For a moment, the hall, the audience, the laughter, it all disappeared. There was only the music and her and the story she wanted to tell. As the last note of the short prelude echoed, she opened her eyes fully and looked at the audience. Some were still skeptical, but others were leaning forward, intrigued. The first step was over. She had arrived on that stage, and despite their doubts, she had made her presence known. The real performance, the one that would leave them speechless, was about to begin. She took another deep breath, lifted her hands again, and felt the familiar thrill that came just before the music really took over. She knew that no matter what happened next, this moment was hers. And for the first time she believed, not just in the music, but in herself. The first few notes had barely filled the hall when a ripple of quiet whispers started to grow. A few people exchanged looks, shaking their heads slightly as if the music they had expected wasn't coming. One person at the back of the room let out a soft chuckle, and it was just enough to make her chest tighten. She felt the weight of their eyes, the way they seemed to see right through her, judging her before she had even really begun. She took a slow, steady breath, reminding herself why she was here. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for the murmurs or the smirks or the judgment that followed her like a shadow. She had practiced every day for months alone in her room, playing when no one else was around to hear, pouring every bit of her feeling into the keys. Those nights had been quiet but full of purpose. Those days of frustration had been hard, but they had brought her here. Still, the laughter stung. One of the men in the third row leaned back in his chair and muttered something under his breath, and a few people nearby snickered. She caught a glimpse of a pair of teenagers whispering to each other and pointing at her shoes. She could feel her fingers tense, her palms a little sweaty, and she thought about walking off the stage just for a moment, but she shook her head. She would not let them see her fear. She pressed down on the keys again, letting the soft, delicate notes flow. This time she tried something a little bolder, a melody that rose and fell, delicate but filled with feeling. Her fingers moved a little faster now, and the music began to fill the empty spaces between the whispers. The first few bars were cautious, careful, but as her confidence grew, so did the depth of the sound. The audience started to shift in their seats. Some were still doubtful, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room for confirmation that they had been right to doubt her. But a few heads tilted forward slightly, and a couple of faces softened. The music was different from what they expected. It wasn't flashy or loud. It wasn't designed to impress right away. It was honest. It had a quiet strength, a story hidden in each note, a feeling that couldn't be ignored. As she continued, her mind wandered back to all the moments that had brought her here. She remembered practicing in the dim light of her bedroom when her parents thought she was asleep. She remembered the small triumphs, finally mastering a difficult piece or feeling the music flow from her hands in a way that made her heart lift. She remembered the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, that her hands were too small, or that her style wasn't right, and yet here she was sitting in front of a room full of people, daring to show them what they didn't expect. A few more chuckles came from the audience, softer this time, as if people weren't sure whether to laugh or listen. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, replaced by a quiet determination. She let herself move with the music, letting the melody guide her fingers instead of her nerves. Each note became a small act of defiance, a way of saying, "I belong here no matter what you think." Her mind focused on the story she wanted to tell through her music. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about impressing the audience with speed or fancy tricks. It was about feeling, about speaking in a language that everyone understood without words. She imagined the people in the audience as blank pages, waiting to be filled with the colors of her music, and for the first time, she felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips. Laughter began to fade. A few people sat up straighter, their curiosity piqued. Some shifted in their seats, leaning forward to catch every note. Even the ones who had whispered and chuckled earlier now looked surprised. The music was changing the atmosphere, transforming the room in a way that no words could. It was no longer just a performance, it was a conversation, a connection between her and everyone watching. Her fingers flew over the keys now, but not recklessly. Every note had meaning, every pause and soft touch carried emotion. She could feel the audience beginning to respond, slowly at first, as if testing the waters. A woman in the front row leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes wide and focused. A man in the back put down his phone, tilting his head slightly, listening more closely. The shift was subtle, but she noticed it, and it gave her a quiet boost of courage. She thought about the small victories that had led her here, the hours alone, the encouragement of a teacher who had believed in her, the late nights practicing scales over and over, and the countless times she had refused to give up even when her fingers ached. All of it mattered now. Every struggle had prepared her for this exact moment, and she let the music flow freely, unafraid. For the first time since stepping on stage, she felt truly in control. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't need to worry about the whispers or the smirks. The audience could doubt her all they wanted, but the piano and the music were hers. She could speak through them in a way that no words could match. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the room began to change. The atmosphere shifted from doubt to attention. People stopped whispering and started listening. The laughter that had seemed so loud a few minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a quiet anticipation. They were waiting now, waiting to hear what she would do next, unaware that the performance was only beginning. A few people exchanged glances, and she caught the momentary surprise in their eyes. They hadn't expected the music to be so full, so moving, so alive. She felt a thrill run through her as she realized that she was not just playing notes. She was telling a story, and they were finally listening. She smiled softly to herself, letting the music guide her. The doubts from before seemed distant now, like echoes of a memory that no longer mattered. She had started cautiously, aware of their skepticism. But now she was beginning to play with confidence. Each note was a step forward, each chord a statement. She was here, she belonged, and her music had something to say. As the prelude drew to a close, she felt the first real connection with the audience. Eyes that had once been full of doubt now held curiosity. Shoulders that had been slumped in boredom were leaning slightly forward. The first few minutes had passed, and she had turned uncertainty into attention. She knew this was just the beginning, that the real magic was still to come. But for now, she let herself savor the small victory. She had made them pause, made them notice, and most importantly, made them listen. The stage felt less intimidating now. The lights were still bright, the hall still large, but she felt the music within her rise like a wave, ready to carry her further. She pressed her hands firmly on the keys, letting the melody grow louder, more confident, more alive. The audience, once doubtful, was no longer laughing. They were watching, waiting, and she could feel their attention turn into something deeper: anticipation, curiosity, a spark of wonder. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to believe that what she had worked for all these years was about to be seen, truly seen by the world. She had reached the point where the music began to shift. The quiet, tentative notes of the beginning had grown into a melody full of life and feeling. Her fingers moved more confidently now, pressing each key with purpose. Every note carried her story. Every chord reflected the years of practice, of struggle, of dreaming alone in her room while the world went on outside. She could feel the music spreading, filling the room, touching the people who had once doubted her. For the first time, she allowed herself to play loudly, letting the keys resonate under her fingers with a strength that surprised even her. The sound was no longer delicate. It was powerful, rich, and commanding. It filled every corner of the hall, vibrating in the air and against the walls. The people in the audience who had whispered or laughed before suddenly stopped. They didn't know what had happened, but they could feel it. The music had changed everything. Some gasped quietly, not in mockery, but in surprise. One person's eyes widened, as if they had never expected to hear such sound from someone they had underestimated. The teenagers who had been pointing at her shoes a few minutes ago now sat frozen, unable to look away, their mouths slightly open. The man at the back who had muttered and smirked earlier leaned forward, his expression caught between disbelief and admiration. She noticed all of this not because she had to, but because her music demanded attention, and the energy of the room reflected back to her in waves. She let the melody flow freely, no longer confined by fear or hesitation. Every note she played was deliberate yet effortless. She felt the story growing under her hands, a story that began with doubt, grew through perseverance, and now soared with triumph. The chords built upon each other, rising higher and higher, sweeping across emotions she had felt 1,000 times but never shared with anyone before. This was the moment when her heart and her hands spoke as one. The audience began to respond without realizing it. A few people leaned forward, their eyes glued to her hands as they moved across the keys. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, feeling it in their chest, their stomachs, in every part of them that could hear and understand music. She didn't notice the change at first. She was lost in her own performance, feeling the music, trusting it to guide her. But slowly she sensed it. The energy in the room had shifted. The doubt that had been so thick at the beginning was melting away. Curiosity, fascination, and awe were taking its place. She remembered the people who had told her she couldn't do it, that she wasn't skilled enough, that she shouldn't try. Every note she pressed down now felt like an answer, a quiet defiance, a gentle but firm "watch me." She didn't play to prove them wrong. They were irrelevant. She played because the music was hers, and for the first time everyone in the room could feel that truth. The sound was no longer just notes. It was an extension of her, speaking louder than any words ever could. As the melody grew, she began to experiment with dynamics. Soft and gentle, then loud and bold, she let her fingers move in ways that made the music feel alive. The piano became an instrument of emotion, telling a story of struggle and determination, of fear transformed into confidence. Each rise and fall of the notes reflected her journey, her persistence, the long nights when no one was around to watch, to listen, or to believe. All those moments were coming together now in a single, flowing performance. The audience's surprise was tangible. Whispers and snickers had vanished completely, replaced by quiet awe. A woman in the front row sat forward, her hands clasped together, her eyes wide and sparkling as if she could see the music itself. A man in the middle of the hall, who had been scrolling through his phone, now had it resting on his lap, completely absorbed. Even the youngest members of the audience, who had been restless at the beginning, now sat completely still, caught in the rhythm and flow of the sound. She allowed herself to smile slightly, feeling a mix of pride and relief. It wasn't that she needed recognition, but it was incredible to feel the shift, to know that the music had the power to change perceptions in an instant. The same people who had laughed, who had doubted, were now listening, holding their breath, leaning into the melody. Her hands moved faster now, but never rushed. Every note had meaning. Every chord was deliberate. Every pause gave the audience space to absorb the emotion she poured into the piano. The music began to climb to its first real climax. She felt it building in her chest, a wave of feeling she had never experienced on stage before. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and grace, carrying the story higher and higher. She played not for applause, not for recognition, but for the pure joy of creating, for the chance to speak through the only language she truly understood. And as the notes rose and swelled, the audience responded in kind. Some leaned forward even more, their expressions a mix of amazement and disbelief. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound move them in ways words never could. A quiet murmur of astonishment ran through the hall. People exchanged glances, silently communicating that this was not what they expected. The smirks and laughter from earlier were gone, replaced by focus, admiration, and a quiet reverence. She noticed the change, but she didn't stop or slow. The music was moving her forward, and she let it carry her, letting the melody guide her through every emotion she wanted to express. The climax passed, and she shifted seamlessly into a softer, more reflective section. The notes were slower now, more tender, almost like a conversation with the audience. Her fingers danced delicately over the keys, bringing a sense of intimacy to the performance. The audience felt it too. The people who had been skeptical now leaned in closer, as if afraid to miss a single sound. The energy in the room was quiet but intense, filled with attention and wonder. She allowed herself to recall the small victories that had led her here. The hours of practice, the nights of frustration, the moments when she had almost given up, but didn't. Every mistake she had made was part of the story now, each one shaping her into the musician she was becoming. Every note she played was a reflection of that journey, a way to share not just skill but heart, persistence, and courage. The music began to rise again, moving toward a second, even stronger climax. Her hands flew over the keys with confidence but with care. She wasn't just playing notes. She was painting a picture, telling a story, sharing a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. The audience responded instinctively. Some gasped quietly. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody move through them. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide, unable to look away. She noticed the subtle movements, the quiet signs of engagement. The audience had become a part of the music, connected to it in a way that surprised even her. She didn't need to see their faces. She could feel the attention, the curiosity, the awe. The room was alive with energy, a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening, something they hadn't expected, something they would not forget. As the final notes approached, she felt a sense of completion, of fulfillment. She had taken them on a journey, From doubt to attention, from surprise to admiration. Every ounce of fear, every nervous glance, every whispered doubt had been transformed into something beautiful. Her fingers pressed down on the keys one last time, and the sound lingered, echoing softly in the hall. The room was silent for a heartbeat, and then another. And though no one spoke, the silence was filled with understanding, with recognition. She had shown them her talent, not through words, but through music. She had taken their laughter, their doubt, and turned it into admiration and awe. And in that quiet, powerful moment, she realized that she had not only performed for them, she had performed for herself. For the first time that evening, she felt completely at peace. She had faced skepticism, ridicule, and doubt, and had emerged not only unshaken but triumphant. Her music had spoken and the audience had listened. Some might never admit how moved they were. Some might never forget the surprise, the beauty, the unexpected depth of what they had just heard. But she knew without a shadow of doubt that she had made an impact. The performance was far from over, but the first real wave of astonishment had passed. The people who had doubted her were no longer laughing. The curious were leaning in, captivated, and she, sitting at the piano, felt a quiet joy, a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with applause or recognition. She had found her voice, and it had been heard. The music continued, flowing naturally into the next part of the piece, carrying with it the connection she had created. The audience was no longer passive. They were participants in the journey, drawn in by every note, every chord, every rise and fall of the melody. She had begun with doubt and laughter, but now in the heart of the hall there was respect, awe, and an unspoken understanding. She was no longer just a young pianist. They were witnessing something extraordinary. And as she played, she knew that the real magic was only just beginning. The music began to swell in a way that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Her hands moved effortlessly across the keys, no longer constrained by nervousness or self-doubt. Every note, every chord seemed to pulse with life, carrying the audience along in its rhythm. She had reached a place where she wasn't just performing. She was commanding the room, shaping it with sound, emotion, and presence. The people in the audience were captivated. Their earlier skepticism had vanished completely, replaced by a mixture of awe and disbelief. Some had leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to take their gaze off her fingers as they danced across the piano. Others had closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them like a wave, feeling it move through their hearts and minds in ways they hadn't expected. Even the ones who had come reluctantly, thinking it would be a boring recital, were now fully absorbed, their bodies still but their attention completely captured. She noticed every subtle shift in the room. The quiet intake of breath as a chord resolved, the slight tilt of a head as someone followed a delicate trill, the slow nodding of an elderly man in the front row, clearly recognizing the talent in front of him. It was as if the music had created a magnetic field, pulling everyone into its orbit. The laughter and whispers from the beginning were now a distant memory, almost impossible to imagine in this moment of shared focus and wonder. Her fingers moved faster, yet with precision. Each note was carefully placed, each chord intentional, creating layers of sound that built on one another like a story unfolding. The music seemed to grow organically, rising and falling, swelling with emotion, dipping into tender moments, then surging with power. It was more than a performance. It was a conversation with every person in the room, a way to express what words could not. She thought briefly of the people who had doubted her, not in anger but in quiet satisfaction. They had laughed when she first sat at the piano, but that laughter had dissolved into something else entirely. Respect, amazement, and perhaps a little humility. And she didn't need them to applaud or cheer. She knew she had reached them, if only for a fleeting moment, and that was enough. The melody shifted again, moving into a section that was both delicate and intricate. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, creating a texture that seemed to shimmer in the air. The audience leaned in as if afraid to miss a single nuance. Some faces were frozen in awe. Others reflected an emotional response. Small smiles breaking out on lips, eyes glistening with unspoken recognition of the beauty they were witnessing. She could feel the energy of the room, a shared heartbeat with the people who were listening so intently. She allowed herself to feel it too. The thrill of connection, the quiet power of sharing something so personal and so alive. The music was no longer just sound. It was a living expression of her determination, her practice, her courage to face the doubt and the ridicule that had tried to hold her back. Every note she played now carried the weight of her journey, the triumph of persistence, and the joy of creating something truly extraordinary. As the music rose to another crescendo, she felt a rush of exhilaration. The chords were powerful, resonant, and full of emotion, filling the hall completely. The audience responded instinctively. Some gasped softly as if the sound had startled them in the best possible way. Others leaned forward, wide-eyed, captivated by the speed, skill, and emotion of her performance. The energy in the room was palpable, a quiet but undeniable force that connected every person present to the music and to her. She allowed herself a brief glance at the audience, just enough to see the impact she was having. The man who had smirked earlier now had his hands clasped together, leaning forward, clearly caught up in the power of what he was hearing. The teenagers who had whispered and pointed were now silent, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. A woman in the front row had her hands lightly pressed to her chest, as if to contain the feeling rising within her. The shift was complete. The room had transformed from doubt and ridicule to engagement and reverence. She felt the music moving her, guiding her fingers with instinct and emotion. The notes came naturally now, flowing in a rhythm that was both deliberate and spontaneous. She had entered a state where she was no longer thinking about the audience, about the stage, or about the past mistakes she had made. She was completely immersed in the music, allowing it to carry her, trusting it to express what she wanted to share. The dynamics shifted again. The soft, intimate notes returned for a brief passage, creating contrast and tension. The audience leaned in, drawn by the delicate touch and the subtleties of her playing. Even the smallest sound seemed amplified in their attention. Every gentle chord, every pause, every slight variation in tempo became meaningful. The quiet moments were as powerful as the loud ones, and she knew it. She had learned through countless hours of practice that music was not just about speed or volume. It was about the emotion behind every sound, the story it told. The hall was silent except for the piano. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the sound, the performer, and the audience completely enraptured. She felt a sense of responsibility, not as a burden but as an honor, to carry everyone along in the journey of her music. It was a rare and beautiful feeling, to know that something she created could move people so deeply. She began to weave complexity into the piece, adding layers of harmony and subtle rhythms. Her fingers moved like they had a mind of their own, exploring every corner of the piano, drawing out the richness of sound hidden within. The audience was completely mesmerized. Eyes were glued to her hands, ears attuned to every nuance, hearts responding to the emotional current she was sending across the room. It was a silent understanding between performer and listener, a shared experience that transcended words. For the first time, she felt the exhilaration of absolute command over the room. She was no longer just a young pianist on stage. She was a storyteller, a guide, a force of expression that the audience could not ignore. And yet there was humility in her triumph. She did not demand attention. She simply offered her music, and the audience could not help but follow. The piece reached its ultimate climax. The notes were bold, cascading in a way that demanded attention and respect. Her hands flew across the keys, precise yet fluid, creating a sound that was both technically impressive and emotionally moving. The audience responded instinctively. Some leaned forward, some held their breath, some whispered quietly to each other, unable to contain their astonishment. The power of the music filled the hall completely, leaving no space untouched. And then, just as suddenly, she shifted to a gentler passage. The contrast was breathtaking. The loud, commanding notes gave way to tender, reflective melodies, showcasing not just her skill but her ability to convey deep emotion. The audience leaned in once more, drawn by the intimacy of the sound, by the vulnerability she allowed them to witness. In that moment, the connection was complete. She had led them from doubt to amazement, from surprise to admiration, and now from admiration to a quiet, shared emotion that filled the room like sunlight. Every chord she played was a declaration, a small triumph, a message that talent and determination could not be ignored. The people who had doubted her were no longer thinking about ridicule or judgment. They were thinking about her music, the journey it represented, and the undeniable truth that someone so young could create something so profound. The transformation in the audience mirrored her own transformation on stage. Fear and doubt had given way to confidence and beauty. She felt a warmth spread through her chest as she played the final notes of this section. The sound lingered in the air, echoing softly, giving the audience a moment to absorb the journey they had just experienced. Some closed their eyes, letting the final chords sink in. Others opened their mouths slightly, caught in the wonder of the moment. And she, sitting at the piano, felt a quiet, profound joy, the kind that comes from knowing you have shared your heart and your talent in a way that truly matters. The silence after the final notes was almost as powerful as the music itself. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the people who had been fidgeting or restless at the beginning sat still, completely captivated by the performance they had just witnessed. She allowed herself a small smile, a subtle acknowledgement of the connection she had created. It was not about applause, it was about impact, understanding, and shared experience. And in that moment she realized something important. This was not just a performance. It was a transformation. For her, for the audience, and for the way she understood her own abilities. She had taken doubt, ridicule, and uncertainty, and turned them into something beautiful, something unforgettable. And as she prepared to continue with the next part of her piece, she knew that the real magic had only just begun. The final part of her performance began with a gentle touch, almost like a whisper. Her fingers caressed the keys, producing delicate, trembling notes that held a sense of anticipation. The audience, already captivated, leaned in even closer. The room was quiet, but the silence was alive, charged with expectation. Everyone seemed to know that something extraordinary was about to happen, though they couldn't yet imagine how powerful it would be. She allowed the melody to grow slowly, carefully layering emotion over each note. It wasn't a rush to impress anyone. It was a careful unfolding, a story told through sound. Every movement of her hands felt natural, as though the piano itself had become an extension of her mind and heart. The music carried her memories, her struggles, her triumphs, all the moments that had led her to this stage. And the audience could feel it, even without words. As the melody deepened, she began to build intensity. The gentle whispers of the piano evolved into rich chords that filled the hall with warmth and resonance. The sound moved through the audience like a wave, washing over them, stirring something deep inside. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music speak directly to them. Others leaned forward, captivated by the skill and emotion she displayed with every note. The energy in the room was electric yet peaceful, a shared experience that connected everyone present. Her fingers danced faster now, moving with grace, speed, and precision. Each note seemed to carry a story, notes of struggle and perseverance, notes of hope and courage, notes of joy and triumph. She played as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life, and for the first time, she could feel the full power of her talent unfolding. It was as if the piano itself was alive, responding to her every thought, her every emotion, her every heartbeat. The audience was mesmerized. No one whispered, no one fidgeted, no one shifted in their seat. Even the most skeptical people had become completely absorbed. Eyes widened, mouths slightly open in awe, hands lightly clasped or resting in laps. They were all caught in the spell of her music. The hall seemed to shrink, becoming a single shared space of sound and emotion, with the piano at its center. She remembered the first moment she had walked onto this stage, feeling uncertain, unsure, and a little afraid. Now every hesitation had disappeared, replaced with confidence, clarity, and purpose. She didn't just play the notes, she told a story with them, a story that the audience could feel in their bones. The music was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone listening, shared and understood without a single word spoken. Then came the turning point of the performance. She lifted her hands higher, letting the melody soar. The sound grew louder, bolder, yet controlled, full of emotion but never chaotic. The chords built one upon another, layering complexity and beauty, creating a climax that demanded attention and respect. Every eye in the room followed her hands, every ear strained to catch the subtle shifts in tone. Every heart seemed to beat in time with the rhythm she created. The power of the music was undeniable. The laughter and doubt from the beginning felt like a distant memory, almost impossible to remember. The audience was completely silent, holding their breath, caught in the brilliance of the performance. Some faces reflected tears welling up, some showed smiles of astonishment, and others simply revealed awe. She noticed all of it, but it didn't distract her. Instead, it pushed her to play even more deeply, to give every ounce of herself to the piano, She let her fingers fly across the keys, creating a storm of sound. Yet within that storm there was order, precision, and beauty. The music rose higher and higher, then softened suddenly, moving into a tender, intimate passage. It was a masterful display of control, emotion, and skill, and the audience could feel the full range of her talent. They were no longer thinking about her age, her appearance, or the laughter from the start. They were thinking only about the music, about the story she was telling, and about the undeniable impact of what they were hearing. Her hands moved in a delicate, intricate pattern now, creating soft trills and gentle harmonies that felt like whispers of emotion. The audience was silent, listening so intently that it was almost sacred. She could see a few people holding their breath, unable to believe that such music was coming from one person, from someone they had initially doubted. She felt a deep connection with everyone in the room, as though the music had bridged the gap between performer and listener completely. The final movement approached, and with it, a sense of anticipation that could be felt by everyone. The music swelled again, louder, fuller, more commanding. She pressed down on the keys with confidence, strength, and grace. Each chord rang out clearly, each note carried weight, each pause was intentional. She had built this moment carefully, weaving together the quiet, the tender, and the powerful, and now she brought it all to a crescendo that would leave the audience breathless. And then she played the final passage. It was a combination of speed, skill, and pure emotion. Her fingers moved across the keys with a precision that seemed almost impossible. The chords cascaded like waves, powerful yet controlled, creating a rhythm that felt like it could shake the very walls of the hall. The melody soared higher, the harmonies deepened, and the energy in the room reached its peak. Every person in the audience was completely silent, caught in a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting.